Soon the hunt will be on for his killer.
So last October, in the lead up to Halloween, I spontaneously decided to do a video on the Underworld franchise, spurred on by a few comments on my Van Helsing video asking for one. So I spent spooky season on a half-hour love letter to the first film and was pleasantly surprised to see it take off so quickly. Underworld is a great little film that does so many things right in ways that me as a kid was very receptive to. But 3 years later, when the time came for its first sequel to arrive, I'd grown savvy and, more importantly, cynical to how a great debut entry could get tainted with an inferior sophomore effort. And on my most recent rewatch, I was surprised at how little I remembered about Evolution, and I had to watch it twice a few weeks apart to really get a sense of it.
See? No need.
When rewatching the first one, or Rise of the Lycans, I knew I loved them almost instantly, and I was surprised about the latter because I remembered despising it at the time. Evolution I always felt meh on. I know I definitely watched it more than once, but never went back to it religiously like the first, and I wasn't about to include it on my list of underrated favourites, and I'm still trying to figure it out.
Now you're being rude.
I don't think it's a bad film by any means. In fact, every time during my 2 rewatches that I felt ready to write it off, a well-done set piece or interesting bit of storytelling came along to make me reconsider. But by the end, I didn't feel as passionate to leap to its defense as I did the first, nor as ready to go on about it being as fun as I will when I get to Rise of the Lycans. So this video will be more about me wondering, did it work at all? Evolution is what we call an immediate sequel, where it picks up right where the first one left off. Selene and Michael are officially on the run, with the former being considered an outlaw by her own kind for killing Victor, the vampire elder she had previously seen as a father figure, but learned he was a bad, bad man. But there was one remaining vampire elder left, ready to be awakened. One Marcus, who actually makes his first appearance in a prologue flashing back to the Middle Ages. Little bits of exposition in the first film had said he had a brother, and we're introduced to William, the first werewolf. Unlike Lucian's Lycans, William was locked in wolf form permanently, and any of those he bit turned immediately and couldn't revert either. Victor had him placed in solitary confinement for eternity, and it turns out that Selene's father was the one who built said prison, with her family being killed to prevent its location from being found out. Selene, of course, was spared, which makes her the only living person who would know how to find it. And Marcus had ended the first film being awakened by a Lycan's blood, but because he's a descendant of the immortal Alexander Corvinus, and shares the same DNA as Michael, that makes him a hybrid now too. With Victor now eliminated, he wants to free William from his prison and basically rule the world as a new god. Oh, and there's this mysterious older man played by Derek Jacobi going around with plenty of ties to all the characters, and he turns out to be Alexander Corvinus himself. So between him and Selene, they have to stop the evil twins from fangifying the whole world.
A new race, created in the image of their maker.
Remember that I used the term immediate sequel a few minutes ago, because that's what I'll start with. In my first video, I noted that Underworld was caught in the middle of how franchise films were being made. As opposed to the 2010s method of intending an interconnected story across multiple installments, it was taking more from the traditional way of only making a second if the first one was successful enough to warrant one. And because everything had to come in threes in those days, we ended up with a formula called the 2-part trilogy, where you tended to have a first film that was obviously made to be standalone, with only the vaguest teasings of plot threads that could be picked up if the box office take called for it, and then 2 sequels that shared more of a connection, with the first being a middle movie that set up plot threads for the conclusion. Underworld did have something in its favour by ending the first film with Marcus getting woken by Lycan blood, and plenty of lore that gave them the freedom to continue the story, so it didn't have to create a continuation out of whole cloth like, say, Pirates of the Caribbean: Dead Man's Chest. But I think going for an immediate sequel format hurt its chances considerably.
Someone could have picked us up already.
One thing I really liked about Underworld is how you were thrown right into something that was already happening, and you were expected to keep up and follow the story as it went on, with only the minimal bit of stopping for exposition. And while Evolution does throw you back into the fray, the fact is that Victor and Lucian are both dead, and the status quo has been shaken up considerably. So the first act of the film is hampered by the fact that it has to set up the way this world has changed, and essentially add multiple PSs onto the ending of the first. And that would be fine if it wasn't at odds with the story they wanted to tell.
Everything's changed. I probably need just a minute to make it all fit in my head. It's a lot to process all at once.
Things like Michael having to abandon his human life and adjust to having to drink blood now, or both him and Celine being on the run are surprisingly glossed over, when I feel like they could have gotten way more out of them. Like, Michael having to hide from the authorities, and Celine having to be on the run when she can't be out during the day seems like enough material for an entire film on its own. It feels like those elements are in the first act only out of necessity, to explain away certain things without much care to fleshing them out.
Normal food could be lethal. If you don't anticipate your cravings, you will attack humans.
And believe me, you don't want that on your conscience.
Personally, I would have had the film take place sometime later, following the same format as the first, where Michael and Celine are already in hiding, and Marcus has already awakened and taken control, with the revelation about Celine's parents being our inciting incident. I felt this even more strongly when I rewatched Rise of the Lycans and enjoyed it immensely more.
You can watch over me from the wall.
It works because Lucian and Sonia are already well into their affair when the main story starts, and it does away with a more traditional inciting incident structure, like the first film, and trusting the audience to keep up with an ongoing story. By contrast, Evolution is paced very weirdly, where the first and third acts are decent enough, but the second is just strange.
You're Alexander Corvinus.
The reveal that this mysterious old man is actually a still-alive Alexander Corvinus comes across as so needlessly casual, and not in the understated way that Craven and Lucian were revealed to be working together in the first.
For centuries I've stood by and watched the havoc my sons have wrought upon each other.
I get the sense we're meant to see it as important, even though it doesn't feel that way. And the choice to have Michael get killed by Marcus at the halfway point, it's such a mundane death that you know he's going to be resurrected at some point, and the movie trying to treat it like a big deal just doesn't work for me. This is the kind of fake-out death that should have happened in the third act, during the final battle, and the gap between that and his resurrection should have been much shorter. There's no tension to the second build lead and friggin' vampire-werewolf hybrid being killed off at the hour mark, and you just know he's going to come back later. But this leads into my next point. I'm not going to claim that Underworld was some kind of small-scale character drama. It was an action movie that was made to be entertaining, but at its core, it was Shakespeare with vampires and werewolves. It wasn't just Celine and Michael's romance, it was Lucian's cunning plan, Craven's political scheming, revelations about Victor, and even characters like Erica, Reyes, and Khan being minor players all contributing to the greater narrative to make it feel like an epic. A big plus in Underworld's favour was its very solid supporting cast that Evolution unfortunately jettisons to make it a one-woman show. Lucian and Victor obviously had to die at the conclusion of their arcs, and Marcus and William are fitting replacements to fill those voids, but Craven is unceremoniously killed in the first 10 minutes. And while I'm not the biggest fan of the character or the performance, it seems like such a waste of time to have him survive the first film only to kill him off in the opening of the sequel with so little fanfare just to show that Marcus means business.
I can assist you. Well, you already have.
It also has the effect of making the antagonist side less complex than the first film, where there was more political scheming going on, as well as the mounting dread as we realise Victor is the true baddie. Evolution, however, just has a generic monster to be stopped, regardless of how much Tony Curran puts into the role.
I have no respect for your petty sentiment.
I said in my previous video that killing off Reyes and Khan was a mistake, and since we never saw bodies, could have had them turn up alive. Erica likewise disappears completely, with no payoff given to her subplot, and the removal of most of these supporting players makes Evolution feel oddly smaller compared to the first. Underworld wasn't just Celine's story. There was a centuries-long conflict going on involving plenty of players, and Celine was just the POV character. We don't even get a glimpse into how the vampire coven reacts to having two elders killed in one night, both of whom by fellow vampires. We don't see the reaction of Celine's friends and allies to her becoming an outlaw, or any of the potential conflict that could result in them now being expected to kill or bring in someone they trusted up until recently. And outside the goings-on of the mansion, the vampires were said to be behind several industries, such as synthetic plasma, and there's not a mention of how these will now be affected by the coven being brought down from within. The Lycans disappear from the story completely as well, and there's no conflict mined from the fact that the surviving ones could rally behind Michael as a new leader, or indeed Celine as his lover. There's no plot involving the Lycans and vampires having to work together to take out a common enemy in Marcus and William. Any werewolves we actually see in the film are just mooks to be taken out. And while I don't dislike the new characters introduced like Tanis and Alexander, they're not given as much time to make an impact as the supporting cast of the first film.
Oh.
It's now just Michael and Celine, with a side of Marcus. And while I love Celine as a character, her story was kind of told already. She has no more growing to do, or development to go through, except becoming more powerful to believably stand a chance against Marcus. While Kate Beckinsale is as charismatic as ever and can definitely carry the film on her own, Celine feels reduced to being little more than a video game avatar on a fetch quest. The fact that no Lycans act as allies or have a function in the story means we don't see her struggle with letting go of the prejudices she'd held onto for centuries. The only difference between Celine at the start and Celine at the end is that she can now go out in the sun, and while Kate Beckinsale's performance keeps her compelling to watch, the character ends up becoming more generic.
Well, then perhaps I'm mistaken and there's no use for you at all.
Michael too was at his most interesting when the story begins, and it does raise some intriguing questions that it promptly ignores to focus on the plot beats. His struggle with now having to only feed on blood and abandon his human life gets one small sequence, and then his feelings on how his entire world has been turned upside down go completely unaddressed.
No! Michael, you'll die.
Him and Celine do make for a fun battle couple, especially in the very solid third act ending the movie on a higher note than it started, but he has no arc and is reduced to a mere plot device who seems to get killed off so early because they didn't have a clue what to actually do with him. Evolution sidelines character and world building for the sake of plot twists and action set pieces when it could have been both. The first film did that just fine, but there was another shift I feel is also relevant here. I mentioned Dead Man's Chest earlier, the second movie in the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, which like Underworld also had 5 entries, owed a lot to one actor doing a lot of heavy lifting in the first, and likewise the first is the only one that's still viewed positively, although Curse of the Black Pearl was more popular with critics than Underworld, and I've seen video essays defending the second and third films, so they are definitely due a rewatch. But one point I likely won't budge on is that both Underworld and Curse of the Black Pearl fell under the umbrella of low fantasy. Fantasy does have many subgenres, but the most common divide between which category a story falls into is whether it's high or low. High fantasy, codified by Lord of the Rings, tends to involve a separate world entirely, more magic, an idealistic good versus evil morality, and high stakes that usually involve saving the world. Low fantasy, meanwhile, tends to favour anti-heroes, a more scientific approach to the mystic elements, more emphasis on human or humanoid characters, and more personal stakes.
Why does she live while your child lies cold?
In Curse of the Black Pearl, the supernatural elements extend only to the curse that makes the pirates undead, and the stakes are about breaking said curse and rescuing Elizabeth and/or Will from them. But the sequels introduced elements such as the Kraken, a sea goddess trapped in human form, and trips to the Underworld to bring dead characters back to life, and became about coming together to defeat one world-threatening big bad. The climax of Curse of the Black Pearl is 3 interconnected fight scenes that are resolved when Will puts a coin in a treasure chest. The climax of At World's End is a big battle in the middle of a maelstrom involving every pirate lord in existence. Underworld, likewise, was based on a scientific reason for the vampire and werewolf curses, and the story was far more personal, involving lots of scheming and every character having a shade of grey, with Michael being the foil to ground the story. Evolution doesn't shift quite as jarringly as Dead Man's Chest, but its villain is now a monster who can fly, and his evil plan threatens the whole world, with our previously grey protagonists being straight up heroes trying to save the day, as opposed to just surviving.
What will I become?
The future.
And there's nothing inherently wrong with a sequel shifting the genre slightly. Aliens, after all, exchanges a claustrophobic horror setting for a more actionized one, and The Winter Soldier takes a throwback to the golden age of comics into political thriller territory, but you'll notice that the instances where it worked also involved a time or setting shift. Aliens takes place 57 years after the first film, and on the planet the xenomorphs originate from rather than the Nostromo, making it logical that we'd encounter more of them, and they'd be less individually effective now that Ripley knows about them. The Winter Soldier likewise takes place 70 years after the first Avenger, and is pretty much all about Cap realizing what a different world it is compared to the 40s. And the shifts allow you to feel that the worlds themselves have simply evolved. Dead Man's Chest and Evolution taking place so soon after the first films, Evolution on the very same night, and in the same location just makes the shift all the more noticeable. Again, having a time skip and starting the film in media res would have helped with that. Even the look of the film changes from this cool, blue-tinted aesthetic to a stark, desaturated grey that feels more appropriate for some generic direct-to-video flick. It had the same director and twice the budget, so why does it look and feel so cheap? But I feel like that's enough of the negativity, because there is actually a good amount to like about Evolution. Once again, Kate Beckinsale goes above and beyond to make this character work.
Anything I've done can be laid at your feet.
Even if the script doesn't give Celine much character development, you see her inserting some of that into her performance. Celine is less apathetic, more driven, and slightly warmer towards Michael, while still feeling consistent with how she was in the previous film. And there's a certain scene in the first act that is kind of infamous. Can't show anything from it on YouTube, but I'll just say I come down on the side favouring it. Yes, you may all giggle at the use of one word. It's quite a novelty to be watching an action horror when there's been all this mounting tension between the male and female lead across 2 films, and the plot just stops in the first act so they can resolve it. Remember that article praising The Mummy Returns for incorporating romance directly into the plot? I'm gonna praise Underworld for the same thing. More so the first film, because Evolution tends to relegate Michael to a sidekick, but his fake-out death does at least give Kate Beckinsale a chance to do some acting. Out of the new characters, Tannis is pretty fun, and supposedly his role in Rise of the Lycans was originally meant for Craven, but yeah, good call.
Careful with that, dear. Makes a terrible bang.
I don't dislike Marcus or William. Tony Curran is having fun in the part, and the design for his bat form is pretty neat, especially since it contrasts to Michael, who was bitten by a werewolf first and then became a hybrid by taking vampire venom, and Marcus started out as a vampire but then got turned into a hybrid with werewolf venom. It's just a shame that Marcus and William ended up as the villains of the middle movie that wasn't planned to go past this chronology. A vampire elder that's now a hybrid and his werewolf progenitor twin brother are most definitely worthy of being the final bosses of a franchise, so the good potential they had sort of feels a bit wasted. There was talk of an extended edition that never materialized, and I imagine that may have fleshed out certain characters and plot points to bring it more in line with the first's quality. Release the Wiseman cut! And a subtle detail in the transition between the 2 films is the use of pathetic fallacy, which we all learned about sometime in English class. Underworld 1 begins in rainfall, and it's mostly raining throughout the story, for a sort of melancholy tone that makes perfect sense when you learn the reasons for the war.
I forced you to watch her die.
Evolution takes place in the snow, since it's now in the winter of the old regime, which is on its last legs. And the movie literally ends with Celine going out into the sun for the first time in centuries. And while it doesn't look as compelling as the first, there are still plenty of set pieces that bring about some of that atmosphere, and make the film feel less generic than I thought it was going to be.
I need you alive. If you die, we all die. Now go!
The prologue featuring all 3 elders is fantastic. The car chase, where Michael has to do battle with Marcus from the back of a truck, isn't amazing, but I appreciate it. And the final battle taking place in the ruins of William's old prison is as solid as that of the first, at least in terms of direction and fight choreography. The fact that there's less characterization to beef the story up does give it less meaning, but the action set pieces are still very watchable. The third act is by far the strongest part of Evolution, and there are interesting storytelling devices, such as using the prologue to tell the audience that William's bites will animate the dead, which Celine herself does not know by the time he's released. and having to kill the vampire elder with a helicopter's rotor blades. The flight itself may not have been solid, but the landing made me feel like I didn't waste my time anyway, kinda like how the episode Hard Home almost redeemed Game of Thrones Season 5. And the ending, featuring Selene getting back what Victor essentially stole from her all those years ago, where she can't completely get her humanity back, but she can at least get something that makes her feel that way, and she's safe from vampire elders and rogue lichens for the time being. That's actually fairly poetic. I dig it. So, Underworld Evolution proved that 3 years did nothing to lower the underground popularity of the newest action horror franchise of the 2000s, and it grossed $113 million, which was a near $20 million incline from the first film's gross. The critical reviews were not kind, to put it delicately, and unlike my previous video, I'm just gonna let it be. All things considered, it was a major step down from what made the first film so brilliant, at least in my opinion. But it isn't completely void of good, and there were plenty of moments that made me want to pour a wine glass and raise it. Not especially high, but worthy of a token toast all the same. All in all, I can't bring myself to slate it completely. I'd give the first film an 8 out of 10, or maybe even a 9, depending on how forgiving I'm feeling towards Craven on a given day. Evolution would get a 6 from me, which is probably why I'm so critical of it. You were almost good, and you fell short. But falling short is most definitely not what we can say about entry number 3 in the franchise. Until then...
But for now, for the first time, I look into the light with new hope.